soldier blocked black woman at the base gate. No access's general came outside and saluted her first. "Ma'am, I don't care what you think you have. You are not getting through this gate. Not today. Not on my watch. Turn your vehicle around." That was Specialist Dennis Howell, 23 years old. 11 months on base security detail at Fort Caldwell, Georgia. Standing at Gate 3, with one hand on the barrier arm and the other resting on his belt, with the particular confidence of someone who has recently been told he has authority and has not yet learned the difference between authority and judgment. The woman in the car was 54 years old. She was wearing a pressed blazer the color of deep burgundy over a white blouse. Her hair was natural and neat. Her hands were on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, because she was the kind of person who still drove that way. She had driven 2 hours and 40 minutes to reach this gate. She had an appointment. She had documentation. She had identification that would have explained everything to anyone who looked at it for more than 4 seconds. Specialist Howell had not looked at it for 4 seconds. He had looked at her, and he had looked at her car, which was a 12-year-old Volvo with a small dent above the rear left wheel well, and he had made a calculation that had nothing to do with her documentation and everything to do with what she looked like sitting behind the wheel of that car at the gate of a military installation, and he had told her she had no access. What Specialist Howell did not know, what he could not have known from his position at Gate 3, because if he had taken the time to look at her credentials he would have found out immediately, was that the base commander, Brigadier General Constance Elaine Moorfield, was at that moment standing at her office window on the second floor of the headquarters building, watching the gate from a distance. And the woman in the Volvo was the reason the general had rearranged her entire afternoon schedule. In approximately 7 minutes, Specialist Dennis Howell was going to understand what it felt like when a professional decision you made in 4 seconds takes the rest of your career to recover from. Nah, hold on. I need you to hear what just happened. This man looked at a woman who drove almost 3 hours to keep an appointment at a military installation, with documentation in her hand, and decided without reading a single word on that documentation that she did not belong there. That is the decision we are talking about today. And I need you to stay with me, because the way this unfolds is something I could not have written if I tried. Let's get into it. To understand who the woman in the Volvo was, you have to start not at the gate of Fort Caldwell, but in a house in Savannah, Georgia, in 1978. A house where the kitchen was always warm and the television was always on, and the bookshelves in the hallway were so full that the books had to be stacked horizontally on top of the vertical ones because there was no other way to fit them. Her name was Dr. Vivienne May Alcott, but the story of who she was began with the story of where she came from, which began with her mother, and a woman named Gloria Jean Alcott, who had worked for 31 years as a records clerk for the city of Savannah, and who had treated every piece of paper that passed through her hands as something that deserved to be done right, because Gloria believed that the difference between a record done carefully and a record done carelessly was the difference between someone's life being legible and someone's life being lost. Gloria had passed this belief to Vivienne before Vivienne could fully articulate what a belief was. Vivienne's father, Robert Alcott, had served in the United States Army for 20 years. He had enlisted at 19, served 2 tours, and separated as a master sergeant with a chest full of commendations and a back that had never fully recovered from a fall during a training exercise in his 12th year. He came home to Savannah and worked as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company and coached youth basketball at the community center on Saturday mornings. And he talked about the Army the way people talk about something that made them and also cost them, with equal portions of pride and honesty. Robert Alcott took his daughter to every Veterans Day ceremony the city held. He took her to the military museum twice a year. He explained rank insignia to her before she started kindergarten. He told her that the institution of the military was not the same as the individuals in it, that the former could be noble and the latter could disappoint you, and that the key to navigating that distinction was to understand both things clearly and let neither one blind you to the other. Vivienne had listened to all of it. She had the kind of listening that her father recognized as active, the small nods, the follow-up questions. The way she went quiet when she was actually thinking rather than when she was simply waiting for her turn to speak. She had also watched her father stand up straighter when he talked about certain things. The way his voice changed when he described soldiers he had respected. The particular quality of his silence when he talked about ones he had not. She learned, from watching him, that service was a serious matter, and that seriousness deserved to be taken seriously. Vivian went to Spelman College on an academic scholarship. She studied political science and history and stayed for a master's degree and then kept going. The way some people keep going because the questions keep getting more interesting the deeper you go into them. She completed her doctorate at Georgetown in military history and civil military relations, with a dissertation on the integration of the United States Army between 1948 and 1975, that her committee called the most rigorously sourced work they had reviewed in 11 years. She became a professor. First at Howard University, where she taught for 9 years and won 2 teaching awards, and published a book that was adopted as supplemental reading in 3 graduate military history programs. Then, as the holder of an endowed chair at the Institute for Strategic Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where she led a research center on military effectiveness and civil-military relations and advised, over the course of her career, more federal agencies and defense committees than she generally mentioned when introducing herself at dinner parties, because the list made people slightly uncomfortable with how long it was. She had also, for the past 6 years, served as a senior civilian advisor to the United States Army's Leadership Development Program. In that capacity, she had worked directly with 47 generals. She had been invited to speak at the Army War College. She had testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee on 3 separate occasions. She had a security clearance that had been renewed twice and that placed her, in terms of access to sensitive military information, several levels above what was required to drive through the gate of a regional Army installation in Georgia. She had all of this documented. It was all in the folder on the passenger seat, alongside her government-issued identification and the appointment letter signed by Brigadier General Constance Elaine Moorfield, who had invited her to Fort Caldwell specifically to conduct a day-long leadership consultation with the base's senior officers as part of the Army-wide Leadership Development Initiative Vivian's Center had designed. The appointment had been scheduled for 6 weeks. The paperwork had been submitted to base administration 5 weeks ago. The visitor authorization had been processed and confirmed. Vivian had received a confirmation email from the base's administrative office 3 days prior. She had printed it. It was in the folder, on the passenger seat, which Specialist Howell had not asked to see because he had already decided she did not belong there. She had left Washington at 5:30 that morning, not because the drive required it. Fort Caldwell was 2 hours and 40 minutes without traffic, and her appointment was not until 10, but because Vivian Alcott was the kind of person who built extra time into every plan for every variable she could anticipate, and some she could not. Her father had taught her this. He called it margin. He said the military ran on margin, and that the people who understood margin were the people who were ready when things went sideways, because things always went sideways eventually. She had stopped once, at a gas station outside of Macon, for coffee and a granola bar. She had arrived at the Fort Caldwell main entrance at 8:47, which gave her over an hour before her appointment, which was exactly the kind of margin she had built in. The main gate, Gate 1, had a line of cars waiting for the morning entry process. Vivian had been directed by the confirmation email to use Gate 3, the visitor access point, which had its own lane and its own procedure. She had followed the directions precisely. She had pulled up to Gate 3 at 8:51, with her folder open on the passenger seat and her government ID in her hand before she reached the barrier. Specialist Howell had approached the driver's side window with the practiced manner of someone who had done this many times and had a clear sense of what it was supposed to look like. He asked for her identification. She handed him her government ID. It was a card issued by the federal government with her photograph, her name, and identification numbers that any security system at any federal installation in the country could verify in under 90 seconds. Specialist Howell looked at the card. He looked at Vivian. He looked at the car. He looked at the card again. Then he looked back at Vivian with an expression she had seen before, That specific recalibration that happened when someone's assumption about what they were looking at ran into information that did not support the assumption, and the person chose the assumption over the information. He handed the card back to her. He said the card was not sufficient for base access. He said she would need a military-issued visitor pass, which would need to be arranged in advance through base administration. Vivienne told him the visitor pass had been arranged. She told him she had the confirmation documentation. She opened the folder and handed him the confirmation email, the appointment letter from General Moorfield's office, and a copy of the visitor authorization form that had been submitted and processed 5 weeks prior. Specialist Howell took the papers. He held them. He appeared to read them in the way people appear to read things when they are looking at something without processing its content. He handed them back. He told her that, regardless of what the paperwork said, he could not authorize entry without verifying the credentials through his system, and that his system was not showing an active visitor authorization for her name. Vivienne told him, with the patience of someone who had been navigating institutional processes for 30 years, that there may be a system discrepancy, and she would be glad to wait while he made a verification call to the administrative office or to General Moorfield's office directly, both of which were listed in the paperwork she had just handed him. Specialist Howell told her that he was not in a position to make calls to the General's office on behalf of visitors who had not been properly pre-authorized. Vivienne looked at him for a moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not show anything in her face that she did not choose to show. She said, carefully, that she had been pre-authorized, that the documentation demonstrated this, and that she was requesting he make a verification call to the numbers listed in the paperwork. Specialist Howell told her that his supervisor was not currently available and that until proper verification could be established through official channels, he could not authorize entry. He told her she could park in the civilian visitor holding area and wait for his supervisor to become available, which could take up to 2 hours. Vivienne looked at him again, longer this time. She was calculating, in the way her father had taught her to calculate not what felt true but what the actual situation was, stripped of feeling, assessed for its components. She said, I have a 10 o'clock appointment with General Moorfield. It is currently 9:03. I have government identification and a confirmed visitor authorization with the General's signature on the appointment letter. I am asking you to make a verification call. Is that something you're willing to do? Specialist Dennis Howell straightened slightly. He said, Ma'am, I don't care what you think you have. You are not getting through this gate. Not today. Not on my watch. Turn your vehicle around. Vivienne did not turn her vehicle around. She put the car in park. She picked up her phone, and she called the number she had for General Moorfield's office, which was in her contacts, because she had spoken to the General's aide 3 times in the 6 weeks since the appointment had been scheduled. Man. She put the car in park. She did not argue. She did not plead. She did not back up. She put the car in park, and she made a phone call. I want you to think about how much it takes to do that calmly. To sit at a gate where someone has decided you don't belong, and instead of escalating or leaving, you simply do the next correct thing. That is a kind of discipline that doesn't come from nowhere. Keep watching. Specialist Howell watched her make the call with an expression that suggested he was confident this would not produce results. He turned away and began speaking into his radio, reporting the situation to whoever was on the other end, using the word unauthorized twice in the transmission. He did not know what was happening on the other end of Vivienne's phone call. Vivienne had reached Sergeant First Class Donna Reyes, General Moorfield's administrative aide, on the second ring. She explained the situation in 4 sentences. Sergeant Reyes said, Dr. Alcott, please hold 1 moment. And the line went briefly quiet. It was quiet for approximately 45 seconds. Then Sergeant Reyes came back and said, Dr. Alcott, the General is aware. Please remain at the gate. Vivienne said thank you and put the phone down in her lap. She sat in her car at Gate 3 and she looked at the barrier arm that Specialist Howell had his hand on, and she breathed slowly and counted, not to calm herself down but to stay precise, because precision was what the moment required. Specialist Howell had finished his radio transmission and come back to stand near her window. He appeared to be preparing to repeat his instruction that she turn her vehicle around. He opened his mouth. A figure appeared at the far end of the base road that ran from the headquarters building to the gate. She was walking quickly, not running, because generals do not run unless the situation requires it, and this situation required something else. She was in full uniform. The stars on her shoulder were visible from 50 yards. She had two aides walking behind her at a pace that suggested they had been informed they were going wherever she was going, whether they were ready or not. Specialist Howell saw her when she was about 30 yards out. He went very still. Brigadier General Constance Elaine Moorfield was 58 years old. She had 34 years of service. She had served in 3 combat theaters, commanded a brigade, and led the Army's Personnel Transformation Initiative for 2 years before taking command of Fort Caldwell. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and had the physical presence of someone considerably taller, which was a function not of posture alone but of what posture communicated when it was backed by 3 decades of absolute credibility. She reached the gate, and she stopped. She looked at Specialist Howell standing next to the barrier arm. She looked at the Volvo with the small dent above the rear left wheel well. Then she looked at Vivian, who had gotten out of the car, and Brigadier General Constance Moorfield, with 2 aides and a gate specialist as witnesses, raised her right hand to the brim of her cover and saluted Dr. Vivian Alcott, not a perfunctory salute, a full, formal salute, held. "Dr. Alcott," she said, "welcome to Fort Caldwell. I am sorry for any difficulty at the gate." Vivian returned the acknowledgement with the dignity of someone who received this kind of greeting in the spirit it was offered, not as a performance, not as a point being made to anyone else, but as a sincere recognition between 2 people who had agreed to do serious work together. She said, "It was good to see the general." General Moorfield held the salute for 1 more beat. Then she lowered her hand and looked at Specialist Dennis Howell, who had not moved, who was standing next to the barrier arm with an expression that could only be described as a man understanding, in real time, the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. "Specialist," the general said. "Yes, General," Howell said. The words came out smaller than he had probably intended. "Raise the gate." "Okay. I have to stop. Because I know what you're feeling right now, and I feel it too. But I need you to understand that the salute was not the end of this story. Not even close. What General Moorfield did next, what happened to Specialist Howell, what happened to the system that allowed this to happen in the first place, that is the part that matters. Stay with me." The gate went up. Vivian got back in her car and drove through Gate 3 and parked in the visitor lot near the headquarters building, which was clearly marked and which she had identified from the base map in her confirmation email. She took her folder from the passenger seat. She straightened her blazer in the rearview mirror. She got out of the car and walked toward the headquarters building. She did not look back at Gate 3. She had been doing difficult things without looking back for 54 years. She was not about to change the method now. Behind her, at Gate 3, General Moorfield had remained. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back and looked at Specialist Howell with an expression her aides recognized as the particular quiet she entered before a very precise conversation. Her aides stepped back approximately 3 paces, which was the distance they had learned represented the appropriate boundary for this category of moment. The general asked Specialist Howell to walk her through his decision-making process, quietly. Specifically, she wanted to understand, she said, what information he had available at the point of decision and what led him to the conclusion he reached. Howell explained. He said the system had not returned a visitor authorization for her name when he ran it. He said he was following protocol for unverified visitors. He said he had informed the individual that she needed to wait for supervisor verification. The general asked if he had offered to contact the administrative office. Howell said his supervisor was unavailable. The general asked if the administrative office number was listed in the documentation the visitor had provided. A pause, a small one, but a specific one. Howell said he had not called the administrative office. The general asked why. Howell did not have an answer that sounded like a reason rather than a choice. General Moorfield asked him what the documentation had said. Specifically, she wanted him to tell her what was on the papers he had been handed. Howell described the appointment letter. He described the visitor authorization form. He described the government identification. He described the confirmation email, with the administrative office seal. The general said, "So you had, in your hands, a government-issued federal identification, a visitor authorization bearing my signature, and a confirmation from this base's own administrative office. And your determination was that she did not have access." Howell said he had been unable to verify through his system. "Thanks for watching." The general said, "The system is a tool. The paperwork in your hand is documentation. When the tool and the documentation don't match, the protocol is to call for verification." Number 5. The verification numbers were on the documentation. You had a phone. What prevented you from making that call? Howell did not answer that question in a way that helped him. The general told Howell that he was relieved from gate duty effective immediately, pending a formal review. She told him that the review would examine his decision-making process and the full record of his interaction with the visitor, including the precise language he had used, which had been partially audible to the second aide at 15 yards, and which would be documented in full. She told him that the outcome of the review would determine his path forward. Then she said, "One more thing." She said, "The woman you turned away this morning has advised 47 generals, including 3 of my predecessors. She has testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. She holds a security clearance that exceeds what you need to understand what that means. She drove almost 3 hours to be here today to help make the officers on this base better at their jobs. You had her paperwork in your hand, and you told her it didn't matter." She paused. "That decision was not about the system being down. That decision was about something else. And the review will look at that something else very carefully." Specialist Howell stood at Gate 3 and said nothing. One of the aides escorted him to the administrative section. The other fell back into step with the general, who walked back toward the headquarters building in the direction Vivian had gone. Vivian was in the second-floor conference room when General Moorfield came in. The room had been arranged for the day's consultation. A long table, chairs, a projector, pads, and pens at each seat. Sergeant Reyes had brought Vivian coffee, real coffee, not the vending machine version, which Vivian noted and appreciated, and had offered to get anything else she needed before the officers arrived. The general came in, shook Vivian's hand with both of hers, and said again that she was sorry. Vivian said she appreciated it and meant it. Then she said, "How long has he been on gate duty?" The general said, 11 months. Vivian nodded slowly. "Then, whatever the review finds, consider this as part of the record from me. The decision he made this morning was not a systems error. The system was a convenient explanation. What happened at that gate was a judgment call, and the judgment was not about my paperwork." The general said she was aware. She said the review would reflect that. Vivian said, "I'm not saying this because I want him punished. I'm saying it because I've spent 30 years studying what happens inside institutions when the quiet decisions, the ones nobody thinks anyone is watching, go one way instead of the other. The small gate moments are what the big institutional failures are made of. If you look at where things go wrong in any military organization, you will almost always find that someone, somewhere, made a small decision that nobody reviewed because nobody thought it mattered. This one matters." General Moorfield looked at her for a moment. "That is why you're here," she said. Vivian picked up her coffee. "Then let's not waste the day." The session ran from 10 in the morning until 4:30 in the afternoon. 14 senior officers attended, lieutenant colonels and 2 other one-star generals who had driven in from neighboring installations specifically for the day. Vivian presented for 90 minutes in the morning, then ran a structured discussion for 2 hours after lunch, then spent the final hour in a roundtable that she later told General Moorfield was the best version of that format she had run in 3 years, because the questions were genuinely good and the officers were genuinely listening. The session was recorded, as all official leadership development consultations were. The recording would later be used as reference material for 3 other installations running the same program. What the officers in that room learned in 6.5 hours they would carry forward. Some of them would describe the day, in evaluations filed the following week, as the most practically useful professional development experience of their careers. One colonel sent Vivian's center a formal letter of commendation 3 weeks later. Another requested a follow-up engagement for his unit specifically. The work was real. The day was real. The value of it was real. And all of it had very nearly not happened because a 23-year-old at a gate had looked at a woman in a 12-year-old Volvo and decided in 4 seconds what she was. The formal review of Specialist Howell's conduct was completed over the following 2 weeks. The reviewing officer examined the gate security log, the radio transmission recording, the documentation Vivienne had provided, and the statements of both aides who had been present when General Moorfield arrived at the gate. The review also examined the base's security system, which confirmed that the visitor authorization for Vivienne's name had in fact been correctly entered and was accessible and had been since the previous week, and that the system at Gate 3 had been displaying correctly at the time of the incident. The system had not been down. The authorization had been there. Specialist Howell had either run the check incorrectly or not run it at all before making his determination. The review also examined the language used during the interaction, drawing on the partial transcription from the aide's account and the full account provided by Vivienne in a written statement she submitted at the general's request. The specific line, "I don't care what you think you have. You are not getting through this gate. Not today. Not on my watch," was documented verbatim. The review concluded that Specialist Howell had not followed verification protocol, had declined to use available resources to resolve a documentation discrepancy, had used dismissive and disrespectful language with a credentialed visitor, and that the pattern of decision-making suggested the refusal had been influenced by factors unrelated to the visitor's documentation. The language on that last finding was careful. It was also unambiguous to anyone who read it carefully, and the people who were going to read it were the people whose job it was to read carefully. Howell was formally reprimanded. He was reassigned from security detail to a non-gate role pending completion of mandatory retraining in visitor processing protocol and professional conduct standards. The reprimand was placed in his permanent service record. His path to promotion, which had been scheduled for review in 4 months, was deferred pending the completion of the retraining and a subsequent evaluation. The base's security training program was also reviewed. The review found that existing training adequately covered technical protocol, but that it contained significant gaps in scenarios involving the intersection of documentation discrepancy and human judgment. A revised training module was commissioned. It would be mandatory for all personnel assigned to gate security across Fort Caldwell. The module was named, in the dry and practical language of military administrative documentation, Visitor Processing and Professional Judgment, Case Studies in Protocol Compliance. In the informal shorthand of the soldiers who went through it, it was called something else. It was called the Gate Incident Module. And when people asked which incident, there was only one answer. Vivienne was back in Washington by Thursday. She had a seminar to run on Friday morning, and 2 committee calls in the afternoon, and a draft chapter due to her editor by the end of the month, and a Tuesday dinner she had promised her friend Carolyn she would not cancel again. Her life was full in the way that a life built over decades of consistent work becomes full not with busyness for its own sake, but with things that had accumulated because she had kept showing up to them. She had told the story of the gate, on Thursday evening, to her friend Carolyn over the phone, not dramatized, not at length. Just the facts in their order, the way Gloria Jean Alcott had taught her to keep records precise, complete, without embellishment, because the truth does not need decoration. Carolyn had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "And then what did you do?" Vivienne said she had put the car in park. She had made the phone call. She had waited. She had driven through the gate when it opened. She had done the work she came to do. Carolyn said, "Vivienne." Vivienne said, "Carolyn." Carolyn said, "That's not a normal response." Vivienne said, "It's the right one." There was a silence. Then Carolyn said, "How do you do that? How do you not? How do you just keep going?" Vivienne thought about it. She thought about her father standing up straighter when he talked about things he respected. She thought about her mother handling every piece of paper like it deserved to be done right. She thought about the dissertation she had written, about the history of an institution integrating against its own resistance, about the slow and imperfect and ongoing work of making things what they were supposed to be rather than what they had defaulted to. She said, "Because the work is real. The work I was going to do in that building was real. The 14 officers in that room needed the day we had. That doesn't stop being true because someone at a gate was wrong about me. If I had turned around, none of that work would have happened. The work doesn't stop mattering because someone tried to stop me from doing it. Carolyn was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said, "Your father would be proud." Vivian said, "I know." She did know. She knew it the way she knew the recipe for her mother's red rice. Not because she was told, but because it was already there. There was one more thing that happened before Vivian left Fort Caldwell that first evening, and it happened quietly enough that it might have been missed if anyone had been looking for something dramatic. General Moorfield walked Vivian to her car at 5:15. The parking lot near the headquarters building was mostly empty by then, the officers and aides and administrative staff having moved through their end-of-day procedures and dispersed to wherever they went when the working day concluded. The light had gone the particular amber of a Georgia late afternoon in autumn, and it caught the glass of the headquarters building's upper windows and turned them briefly gold. They walked without hurrying. The general asked about Vivian's drive back and whether she needed anything before she left. Vivian said she was fine. She had water in the car and a podcast she had been meaning to get to for 2 weeks. She would be back in Washington before 10 if the traffic around Atlanta cooperated, which it frequently did not, and which she had built into her margin. The general laughed at that. A real laugh, not a professional one. "You and your margin," she said, and then clarified that Vivian had said that phrase 3 times during the afternoon session, and that 2 of the colonels had written it down, and she suspected it would appear in their evaluations the following week. Vivian said her father would have appreciated that. They reached the Volvo. Vivian put her folder on the passenger seat, the same way she had placed it on the way in. She straightened and looked at the general. "Connie," she said, and the name meant something, the informality of it. The 19 years of professional history that authorized it. "You know, this is not the first time something like this morning has happened to me." The general said she knew. "And you know it is not the first time it has happened at this installation. Not specifically this, but something in this family." The general was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The review will be thorough." "I know it will. That's not what I'm asking." Vivian looked at the headquarters building, at the gold in the windows, at the flag above the main entrance moving slowly in the late afternoon air. "I'm asking whether the review will be the end of it or the beginning of it. Whether the module gets filed and referenced and eventually forgotten, or whether someone decides that this is the thing you build from." General Moorfield looked at her. She said, "I am deciding that right now." Vivian nodded. She got into the car. The general closed the door and stepped back and raised her hand again in the same salute she had given that morning at the gate. Briefer this time, personal rather than formal. The kind of salute that meant something different from the one made with witnesses. Vivian acknowledged it, pulled the Volvo out of the visitor lot, and drove through Gate 1, the main gate, which was open and unobstructed, and turned south toward the highway. She drove for 11 minutes before she allowed herself to cry, briefly, the way her mother had never cried in the daytime but sometimes at night through the thin wall. Not from pain exactly. From the accumulated weight of being someone who kept showing up to hard rooms and hard institutions and doing the work anyway, and from the particular tiredness that came from doing it with grace, because grace was not the absence of effort. Grace was effort that did not show its seams. She cried for 3 minutes. Then she put on the podcast she had been meaning to get to, and she drove home. 6 months after the Gate 3 incident, Vivian was invited back to Fort Caldwell. This time, the invitation came not just from General Moorfield but from the Installation Command jointly, which meant it had been agreed upon at a level above a single commander's preference. The second consultation was expanded to include officers from 2 neighboring installations. It ran for 2 days. 41 officers attended. On the second morning, General Moorfield pulled Vivian aside briefly before the session started. She told her that the revised gate security training module had been completed and had been distributed to 4 other Army installations that had requested it after hearing about Fort Caldwell's revision. She told her that the module was being reviewed for potential inclusion in the Army-wide security training framework. She said the department that oversaw installation security was considering a broader policy revision, and that the Fort Caldwell incident had been cited in the internal memo that initiated the review. Vivian listened to all of this. She asked how Specialist Howell was doing. The general said he had completed the retraining. She said his evaluation had been positive. She said he was young, and the expectation was not that young people would not make mistakes, but that they would learn from them and that the learning would be real. Vivienne said that was the right standard. She walked into the conference room and set up her materials, and when the 41 officers filed in, and she looked at the room, the way she always looked at a room before she started, not as an obstacle or an audience, but as a collection of people who had shown up to do something serious, and who deserved the best version of what she had to offer. She began. Somewhere in Savannah, in a house that was someone else's house now but that still stood on the same street where it had always stood, there was a bookshelf in the hallway where the books had once been stacked horizontally on top of the vertical ones because there was no other way to fit them. That house was where Vivian Alcott had learned that a record done carefully was the difference between someone's life being legible and someone's life being lost. It was where she had learned that the work was serious, and that seriousness deserved to be returned. It was where her father had explained rank insignia before she started kindergarten and told her that the institution and the people in it were two different things, and that the work of making the institution what it was supposed to be fell to the people inside it who were willing to do it. Vivienne had been doing that work for 30 years. She intended to keep doing it. The gate at Fort Caldwell was not the first one that had tried to turn her around. It would not be the last. But she had put the car in park, and she had made the call, and she had driven through when the arm went up, and she had done the work she came to do. That was the method. That had always been the method. And when her father had taught it to her, standing in the kitchen of that house in Savannah with his back that never fully healed and his chest full of commendations and his particular way of making the serious things sound like they were worth the effort, he had not said it would be easy. He had just said it would be right. He had been correct, as he generally was. The work continued. Before you go, I want to speak to you directly for a moment. This story is fictional. Dr. Vivian Alcott, Specialist Howell, General Moorfield, Fort Caldwell. These are characters and a setting built to carry a story. But the experience at the center of it is not fiction. There is a long and documented history of Black professionals, people with credentials, clearances, appointments, years of serious work behind them being stopped at the gates of institutions they have every right to enter, by people who made a judgment before they read a single word on the paperwork. And the question that story raises is not only about the person at the gate. It is about the institution that trained them, the culture that made that 4-second judgment feel safe to make, and the systems that did or did not hold it accountable afterward. What Vivian did in response is also worth sitting with. She did not perform. She did not escalate for its own sake. She put the car in park and did the next correct thing. And then she went inside and did 6.5 hours of serious work that made 41 officers better at their jobs. That is not a small story. That is, in fact, the whole story, not the gate, not the salute, but the work on the other side of both of them. So, here is my question for you. If you were one of those 14 officers in that conference room, and you found out afterward what had happened at the gate that morning, what would you have done with that information? Would you have said something? Filed something? Let it pass? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to read everyone. And if this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to think about it too. Like this video if it stayed with you. Subscribe if you're new here. We are here every week with stories like this one, and we will see you next time.